Great. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Socialist Solutions to the Climate Crisis. This is a meeting organised in cooperation between the Marx Memorial Library, who have generously allowed us to use this space tonight, the Morning Star newspaper. I'm the editor of the Morning Star, Ben Chaco, and is now repeating my words here. The Friends of Socialist China. The Friends of Socialist China organisation. This is the second meeting that we've held here at the MML, and we're very pleased to have organised this meeting in collaboration with the Cuba Solidarity Campaign and the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign. I hope we've got some brilliant speakers lined up. I hope we'll have a really interesting discussion on how policies around climate change differ between socialist countries and capitalist countries such as our own. I'm going to be making a few more remarks in a few minutes, but our first speaker for tonight to introduce the evening is the Nicaraguan ambassador, Guisell. So over to Guisell. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Marx Memorial Library for hosting us tonight, and NSC and CSC, the campaign too, for joint forces and Friends of Socialist China too. So when we see climate change, we know that it's no longer a threat or a hypothetical problem of future generation. It's here and now. But also it's here and now, the knowledge, the science, the means are here. To decarbonize electricity grids and transport, to slash pollution levels, to grow food sustainably, to recycle waste, and for the forest to be replanted. But these two things require planning and resources. And capital countries, the historical and actual biggest polluters, are not willing to carry out the radical changes that are required because are not profitable. Only socialist and revolutionary countries are putting the planet and people over profit, with bold transformative actions to curtail climate change. Only socialist and progressive governments can bring the daring transformation to overcome this threat to humanity. The panelists, Dan, Lauren, and Paul, will explain the efforts made by socialist, revolutionary, progressive countries to overcome climate disaster, specifically how Nicaragua, Cuba, and China are making huge environmental achievements to improve the living condition of working people in harmony with the planet. Nicaragua Sandinista, one of the few countries in the world to be developing sustainably, and with environmental protection enshrined in the Constitution, has shown that with political will and leadership, even a small country, economically and on geographical speaking, can be a global leader in sustainable growth and the fight against climate change, despite the sanctions imposed by US and Europe, for daring to defend its model, its path of development, its sovereignty, and demonstrate with an example that another world is possible. While contributing very little towards global emissions, 0.02%, Nicaragua, sixth in the world among the most vulnerable countries, is disproportionately feeling the effects of climate change, suffering more strong and frequent tropical storms and hurricanes category 4-5, Mitch in 98, Felix in 2007, Eta and Iota in 2020. The last one, the disaster, we have 2 fatalities and damages equivalent to the 6% of the GDP. But also La Niña y El Niño rainfall behavior causing floods and droughts. At global level, since Paris COP21 in 2015 and in all international stages, Nicaragua, along with the ALBA group at the G77 plus China and like-minded countries has been a strong voice urging for climate justice, based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, calling for the indispensable compensation and direct and unconditional cooperation, advocating for climate finance for the protection of forests and biodiversity to generate clean energy and restore the right to health and life of Mother Earth and the peoples of the world. Out of 100 billion climate finance committed in 2015 in Paris by developed countries, less than 14 billion has been provided, denying the recuperation of the effect of climate injustice and collectively avoid the risk of the worst consequence for the planet and humanity. Nicaragua, along with several nations, has demanded in recent COPs to those responsible for the depredation, depredation, to recognize our losses, the damage they have caused, and contribute to recovery. All initiatives to elevate losses and damages to the same category of mitigation and adaptation within the framework of the Climate Convention have been blocked by the United States. Progressive Nicaragua is responding by putting humanity and people first, and is doing its part, the same as all socialist countries. Knowing that the extinction facing humanity can only be resolved through structural changes, the Sandinista government is building a social model based on solidarity, inclusion, and equity, focusing its human development plan on using with respect the Earth's natural resources for social and national development, on achieving the buen vivir, the living well, implementing a series of emblematic climate and developing policies, programs, and projects, such as the Renewable for Energy Program, the Zero Hunger, the Program and Food and Sovereignty Program, the Low Interest Credits and Productive Bonus Program for small farmers, the food packages, healthy patios, and school nutrition programs, the promotion of production based in agroforestry and agroecology, all resulting on the drastic reduction of malnutrition, chronic malnutrition from 27% to 11%, on the country producing 90% of the food it consumes, and reducing by half the general poverty and extreme poverty, while cutting emissions without compromising the economic development of the country. UN Secretary General said, if we want to avert climate catastrophe, renewables are the only credible path forward. Together, let's jumpstart a renewable revolution and create a brighter future for all. Thus, this year, Nicaragua, under Sandinista leadership, started that renewable revolution in 2007, changing its energy matrix. Now we rank 8th in the world in promoting policy towards developing affordable and not polluting energy. But this is not just Nicaragua. It's China. It's also Venezuela. It's also Cuba. So in Nicaragua in 2006, 54% of the population had access to electricity, and only 25% of the energy was renewable. The current coverage is 99.3%, and 78% of the energy comes from renewable sources now. And the goal is to achieve the 90% by 2023. Under the strategy for the reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, we are developing programs to capture 47.3 million of tons in 20 years, integrating ecosystem conservation with sustainable production to increase the resilience of the livelihood of campesinos, indigenous, and Afro-descendant people. We are promoting community forestry, forest plantation, and the establishment of agroforestry and silvopastoral systems. We are implementing the Forest Carbon Cooperative Fund and the National Fund for Forest Investment. We have a policy and national plan on adaptation, mitigation, and response system to climate change to adapt and preserve the nation's natural areas and environment service, implementing large forest recovery programs in Bozaguas and Indio Maiz Reserve, one of the two biggest reserves for Central America. The lungs of Central America, we could say. in the dry corridor also, and we are implementing the National Reforestation Crusade with people, with young people being part of it, improving the resilience of ecosystem and the conservation of biodiversity to make rural livelihood sustainable. Fight climate change and to achieve the sustainable development goal are undermined by the imposition of illegal, unilateral, coercive measures by imperial forces. The capitalist system is killing the planet with its insatiable pursuit of profit and market anarchy, destroying the environment, wiping out ecosystem and biodiversity, and polluting the air we breathe and the water we drink. Capitalism is driving us to extinction. Socialism is the future, the survival. The need to create the new international socialist economic model is urgent because we deeply believe in our path towards a better, just, and human world. We are convinced that it is possible for all the people of the world. Thank you.
So much, Guisell. That was an inspirational explanation of what the Nicaraguan government is doing. Will it cause problems if I stand up or?
If you just hold the microphone.
Ah.
Yeah, if you just hold it.
Great. Don't press it. Down. Yeah, sit down, do as you're told. Okay. Yeah, it falls to me to introduce the sort of main speakers of the evening and the topic of the evening, which is socialist solutions to the climate crisis. There aren't many respectable politicians in Britain who deny the existence of the climate crisis. The Donald Trump style, there's no global warming thing is not politically respectable here. And of course, partly due to the activism of groups like Echaverry and partly due to people's, actual experience of heat waves and flooding on a level that we haven't seen before, even in Britain, combined with seeing on the news really terrible droughts, wildfires and so on around the world occurring with ever greater frequency, people understand that climate change is with us. It's a problem that needs to be solved. But there is a bit of a disconnect when it comes to what are the political solutions to this crisis. Our government says that climate change is a huge priority for it. Boris Johnson, we hosted the COP26 in Glasgow, and Boris Johnson went to COP27 in Cairo and said, Britain is a global leader in challenging climate change and so on. They talk as if they're doing a huge amount about it. But we see this alongside continuing subsidies for fossil fuel industries. We see it alongside ongoing attacks on public transport. If you're serious about reducing emissions, do you really want to keep raising the price of traveling by train every single year? Do you want to fire half of the staff on your railway network? Do you want to cut all of the local bus routes? That's what our government is doing to public transport. And do you want to leave the climate transition in the hands of the very companies that profit the most from extracting and selling and burning fossil fuels? Well, our whole strategy as a British state appears to be, yes, you rebrand British Petroleum as Beyond Petroleum, and it can continue to do exactly what it did before. And suddenly it's a sort of climate hero instead of a company which has a vested interest in making sure that we do not transition away from fossil fuels, at least until they've extracted the maximum profit out of the status quo. So that is the sort of disconnect in Britain. We see abroad different situations. We see some examples in other countries. China, we're going to hear a little bit more about later, but one issue I raised in meeting after meeting, and I was speaking at another meeting earlier today and raised it again, was to do with the transport issue. It's a dear one to my heart, but China is the largest country to have rolled out an extensive high-speed rail network, and therefore one of the few countries that can directly compare what happens to domestic flights when you introduce a high-speed railway along the same routes. And there's good evidence that people stop flying. If there's a high-speed train, people stop flying. And lots of people have said to me, even decent socialist trade unionists, there's no point in developing high-speed rail networks in Britain because in Britain, it's a small country, we don't really need it. But lots and lots of people in Britain do fly between London and Glasgow, London and Aberdeen and so on. There are lots and lots of domestic flights on routes which, if we had trains as fast as Chinese trains, even trains as fast as French or German trains, would take, half the time and be far cheaper, because that's the other aspect. It's much cheaper to fly to Scotland than it is to get to Scotland by train. It's an absolute scandal that that's the case. And we can look at a practical example in China, how high-speed rail cuts flights, cuts emissions. Why don't we do that here? To take another example from a capitalist country, controversially, Germany, but Germany last summer, for 3 months, did an experiment where they had a €9 for travel anywhere by rail in the country ticket. For €9 you get that ticket. I got one when I was briefly in Berlin. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to stay in Germany long enough to exploit it to the max. But you could travel not on the highest speed trains, not on the highest intercity trains and so on, but on any train around Germany, any local train, for €9 all month for that one ticket. And after 3 months, the government said, we've reduced carbon emissions by 1.8 billion tons. Now, they ended the project. You're like, what? Surely that was a success. Surely all Europe should be saying, wow, this is a great idea. We should be adopting it. But no, because vested interests are saying, we don't want you to do this, even though it cuts carbon emissions, because our profits are affected by it, which shows how the vested interests in the capitalist system are actually blocking a rational approach to what even they accept is an existential problem for huge swathes of humanity. Our government's attitude on this is worse than useless. It's actually repressive. If we look at the legislation going through Parliament, it's gone through Parliament already with the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, going through Parliament now with a public order bill. It is about targeting climate protesters. It's not only about that. It is actually, I think, a much broader project of shutting down democratic protest in Britain entirely. But the climate protesters are in the front line here, and they are being used as the sort of scapegoats for this policy of saying, well, the police can shut down a protest before it even starts. The police can say, well, you were on a protest before, we think you're a troublemaker, we're going to ban you forever from ever going to another protest. This is all law that's, in the process in Parliament right now. And it shows the government does not care about climate crisis. Its attitude to people who raise this problem is, we're going to lock you up. So we are not having a solution to a problem, even though the problem is accepted by the people who are in charge of this country. On policy levels, climate change is always treated as one isolated aspect of policy. It's not tied to other aspects of policy, such as transport, which I think I've probably talked enough about. But the other big question here is war. And the US military is the largest polluter on the planet. Now, when we talk about military budgets, when we talk about raising arms spending, people do not tie that to the issue of climate change, but they really should. The militarization of Europe in the wake of the war in Ukraine has massively retarded action on climate change across the continent. The German Green Party, who are now the biggest cheerleaders of escalating the war in Ukraine, have actually endorsed the idea of reopening coal mines in Germany and coal-fired power plants, something they were always against because of it's a price worth paying for sanctioning Russian gas to burn something that's far more polluting than Russian gas. We're seeing the same situation in Britain exactly with the opening of a new coal mine in Cumbria, and the idea of sanctions on Russia and limiting the flow of gas being used as an excuse not to invest in renewables, but to actually reopen a more polluting form of fossil fuel industry. There was an article in the Morning Star, also in People's World earlier this week, looking at the situation with the Arctic Council, which again is very worrying. The Arctic is a very fragile ecosystem. We'll all have watched documentaries about the melting of the ice caps in the Arctic. But the Arctic is not the territory of any one country. Its management is by an Arctic Council of countries on the Arctic Rim. About half of the Arctic Rim is Russia. Some of the rest of it is Canada, America in Alaska, Iceland, Greenland, which is Denmark, Norway and Sweden and Finland. And as a result of the war in Ukraine, the US has put pressure on the other countries successfully to all withdraw cooperation from the Arctic Council. As a result, there is no international body now monitoring the Arctic or protecting the ecosystem there. NATO has taken over the roles that the Arctic Council used to manage in terms of managing the idea of exploiting the resources of the Arctic. And of course, half of that area will remain Russian, and the Russians are also looking at exploiting those resources. But we've gone backwards. Whatever your views on this war, we've gone backwards from a situation where we had some level of international cooperation to one where all of the parties are now out for themselves, and how much can we get out of this fragile region. So this is becoming a lengthy and probably tedious introduction to this topic. But when we look at the challenges to this really myopic way of dealing with things, the slogan on the XR demonstrations in Britain has often been system change, not climate change. And there was a Young Communist League banner at one of the big XR demonstrations, which read socialism or extinction. Now, the Extinction Rebellion distanced themselves from that and got a stern rebuke in the Morning Star as a result. But I would say that if you look at the policies that are pursued by socialist countries on climate change, there is a real difference that you can detect. They may not be perfect in all kinds of ways. You can criticize the different policies that are being adopted, but there is an attitude in Beijing, in Havana, and in Nicaragua that there's a problem here, and we are going to look at how we can resolve it, and we're going to try different methods of resolving it. And I don't believe that is the attitude in New York or London or Paris or any of the capitalist countries. So that's the theme for tonight. I've banged on for ages. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Dan Kovalik, who is all the way from Pittsburgh, a lecturer in international human rights law at the university there, the author of this excellent book on Nicaragua. And he's going to talk to us about the Nicaraguan situation and its attitude to climate change. So thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you. And thanks for everyone coming out on a cold evening. First of all, I want to make a pitch for the Marx Memorial Library, because we're here. I got to sit at Lenin's desk, which is upstairs. As we know, in many parts of the world, I was just in Donetsk, I was in the Donbass, and as we know, a lot of Soviet monuments are being taken down, a lot of monuments to the Red Army. And to have a place like this that still preserves that history and has memorials to the Soviet Union, to me is very, very important. And so I want to give a pitch to the library. And if you get this brochure, there's a barcode there. You can go and become a member. This is the 90th year for this library. So I just want to, maybe we give a round of applause to the library for having us here. Yes, I mean, the question of climate change is a complicated one, and I think I want to echo some of the things that you said. I mean, while I think we all agree that climate change is a problem that we need to tackle, I think a lot of times what we're being told to do to tackle the crisis are things that favor the very rich. That is to say, the very rich who've made most of the carbon are the ones that do not want to sacrifice to deal with that problem. They want us to sacrifice. They want poor people and working people to sacrifice. And I think that is a very wrong-headed avenue. In fact, what comes to mind is, of course, during COVID, when all of us were told to stay in our houses, you had the 3 billionaires who went into space, of course, which uses an incredible amount of carbon. And of course, there is not only this disparate impact and creation of CO2 by the super rich individuals, but also by the rich countries, right? The rich countries of the world, particularly of the West, particularly the United States, are the biggest carbon emitters in the world and historically have been. And yet again, they want the developing world to shoulder a disparate burden of dealing with the climate crisis. Just one example you may have heard of before in terms of this disparity. The Dallas Cowboys football stadium, when it has a game night, uses more electricity that night than Liberia does for that entire day. And that is the type of disparities that we have to deal with in the world. And again, I think it's important, again, to talk about the things that countries like Nicaragua and Cuba and Venezuela do to tackle climate change, again, that may seem indirect, but are very important. One is poverty reduction, that Her Excellency, the ambassador from Nicaragua, talked about. When there are studies that show when people are raised out of poverty, CO2 emissions actually decrease. For example, I'll give you one example of this. When I first went to Nicaragua in the 80s, the first thing one would notice when they got off the plane is the smell of wood burning, because so many people, poor people, were burning wood and coal and maybe garbage to heat their homes, right? But when you lift people out of poverty, you give them electricity, you give them decent running water, decent sewage, you cut down on pollution, you cut down on CO2 emissions. As you're mentioning, I guess we're moving backwards in Europe where people are now burning wood again to heat their homes, which again gets to the next subject, and that is the subject of war and the military. You mentioned the U.S. is the biggest CO2 emitter in the world, which is true, but the U.S. military emits more. And even counted separately from the United States as a country, the U.S. military emits more CO2 than any single source on Earth, including any other country. And yet that is not factored into, as you say, when we talk about CO2 and carbon emission and generally the destruction of the environment. Think about the Iraq War. Do you remember the pictures of the Pelicans dripped in oil, right? All of the environmental degradation that happened during conflicts like that in Iraq. One very dramatic casualty of this conflict in Ukraine was the destruction of Nord Stream 2, which everyone admits was sabotage, was clearly done by some party in the West. And it caused the greatest methane leak known in human history. Methane impacts global warming 20 times more than CO2. And yet who is protesting that? You mentioned in Germany how they're now going back to coal. In fact, Greta Thunberg recently was arrested with some compatriots in Germany protesting the expansion of a coal plant. Well, that's fine and good, but the reason they're expanding the coal is because of the war in Ukraine, right? That I believe the West and NATO helped to provoke. Had little things been done to prevent that war, such as, again, agreeing Ukraine would not be part of NATO, agreeing that the government in Kiev would stop attacking the Donbass, and you did not have the war, you would not have had the blow up of Nord Stream 2, and you would not have the Green Party of Germany leading the charge to go back to coal, right? Protesting the expansion of one coal plant is really putting the cart before the horse in terms of focusing on this, which again gets us to the socialist governments we're talking about tonight. Jimmy Carter recently said, former President Jimmy Carter, in a conversation with Donald Trump about China, he said, well, China hasn't been in a war since 1979. And that's allowed them to build all these speed trains. And he said to Trump, where are your speed trains? Of course, the U.S. has none. Amtrak, which goes about 40 miles an hour. That's the truth. On these old trains in the US, and by the way, again, which is a classic capitalist problem, the tracks are owned by the freight companies. So the passenger trains have to yield to the freight trains. I've been on a train where I sat for hours, completely stationary in the middle of my trip to allow freight trains to go by. That is the rationality of capitalism. And again, because the US has spent all of its money on war, about half our budget goes to war. We just passed a record budget of $850 billion on the military, right? More than the next 11 countries combined. And again, when countries like China, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, they spend so little on the military, they're able to do more to spend money, not only on their people, but on fighting climate change. And again, the money that doesn't go to the military in and of itself, because the military creates so much CO2 and does so much environmental destruction, simply prioritizing the people over the military itself is a plus, a double plus good for global climate change. And in fact, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua have led the way to fighting the war machine and to bringing peace. Venezuela and Cuba hosted successfully the peace talks in Colombia, which resulted in a peace agreement. Nicaragua led the way to a nuclear-free zone in Central America, which, by the way, the U.S. recently violated that zone by doing NATO exercises with its partner Colombia with a nuclear submarine. But again, these countries are focusing on peace and on their own people over war. Recently, in fact, Lula da Silva, the new president of Brazil, when asked whether he was going to send weapons to Ukraine, he said, no, our war is with poverty, not with Ukraine or not with Russia. And that is the position of countries like Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba that reject war and reject violent means to deal with their issues. By the way, the U.S. is quite aware of this and is very upset that Latin America isn't doing more to support the war effort. And in fact, is doing treacherous things like making agreements with China instead to build speed trains in their own countries, right? And so recently, Laura Richardson, who's the head of U.S. Southcom, the U.S.'s military organization in the U.S. southern western hemisphere, said that the U.S. Sees these relationships Latin America has with Russia and China as a threat, and said that they would gladly substitute U.S. weapons in Latin America for Russian ones, and that those Latin countries, if they bought those or were given those, would be free to then go ahead and sell them to Ukraine. But again, the Latin American countries are saying no, particularly Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. But in addition to those, again, indirect ways to fight climate change, which again are maybe the best thing you could do to fight climate change, the triumvirate of Cuba, Venezuela, and Cuba are doing a lot directly, not only to fight climate change, but to create a better environment in the world. Cuba, I believe, is still the only country in the world that has 100% organic farming, which is incredible, right? The whole country is organically farmed. Guisell mentioned the fact that Nicaragua is now nearly 100% food sovereign, meaning almost all the food they eat, they grow themselves, which again is not only good for the people, not only good for the farmers, it's good for the environment, right? Because when you're shipping food for miles and miles, as we do in the West, shipping strawberries from Chile, for example, to the United States, or even apples and other fruits from California or Hawaii to the United States or Europe, you're using a lot of CO2 to do that. Have you ever seen that? I've seen this picture a lot on social media. It's just of a little cup of fruit, and it says on it something like grown grown in Peru, harvested in Vietnam, right? When that's your supply chain for fruit and vegetables, right, you're going to create a lot of CO2. And Nicaragua is first amongst countries trying to essentially just eat what they grow themselves, which is a huge benefit on CO2. But in addition, Nicaragua is leading the way in terms of alternative fuels. They, I believe, are now about 80% of their fuel now is alternative fuels. Number one, I believe, is sugarcane, which is used as a biofuel, and they use their many volcanoes. I think 19 volcanoes in Nicaragua for geothermic energy, and they use wind energy as well. This is a fact, again, that a lot of people, I think, overlook when they look at countries like Nicaragua, that they are leading the way in terms of renewable energy. I also have, when I first went to Nicaragua in 1987, in the first phase of the Sandinista Revolution, I did reforestation work, and Guisell mentioned that Nicaragua was doing a lot in terms of not only reforestation, but protecting their rainforest, protecting their forest. And I have just some information here from the late Paul Oquist, who was worked for the Nicaraguan Foreign Ministry, and he mentions the autonomous region of the Southern Caribbean. The government in the 1980s, the Sandinista government, created the autonomous region of the Northern Caribbean and the autonomous region of the South Caribbean. By the way, the two only autonomous regions in the Western Hemisphere, to devolve rights over natural resources, health, and education to local residents with special protections for indigenous and Afro-Caribbean rights. The traditional lands have been delimited and titled. A total of 23 Indian and Afro-descendant territories composed of 304 communities has received title to over 38,000 square kilometers of inalienable land in perpetuity. This community's rights are represented by territorial governments that can sign leasing agreements for economic activities benefiting their population. And again, it protects that land from exploitation. Not enough can be said about those types of efforts. In addition, in 2020, the government of Nicaragua reforested using a landscape approach 1.2 million hectares of land, which were degraded over the decades by agricultural frontier. They are also going to sequester, Nicaragua is going to sequester 11 million metric tons of greenhouse gases, which is, again, an amazing feat. So I'll just end my talk by talking a little bit about this multipolar world that's being developed, which I think is relevant to all this, and again, which the U.S. sees as a great threat. That Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela are benefiting now from ties with China and Russia and Iran. And they get criticized for this, but I want to emphasize that these are countries that would be very happy to deal with the United States and to trade with them. And yet they've been forced, frankly, to turn east for their economic ties because of very brutal U.S. sanctions, embargoes, and blockades against these countries, which have forced them to go to the East to get help. But the East has been there, again, Russia, China, and Iran, to give them assistance. And again, in ways that will also benefit the environment, again, particularly through these that will cut down on CO2. So I see that as a welcome, something we should welcome and not fear. So those are in essence my remarks on this, and thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Dan, and that was a real tour de force in terms of the real leadership that's being shown in some parts of the world. And I think that in this country, and there's a number of different policy fields where we ought to bear this in mind, but our media, our political elite, they think of, Britain as an imperialist country. It's one of the developed world. We have nothing to learn from these other parts of the world. And that attitude infects the left subconsciously all the time, that we feel, things that are done in a third world country are not worth us looking at. That's the sort of attitude. And actually what we've seen in recent years in a number of parts of the world are examples of policies which actually could be adopted here, which could really be really useful here. And that's not just the case with a major global power like China. That is actually the case with small countries in Latin America as well. And I think that this sort of red wave that we're seeing in Latin America, I called it a pink wave at a meeting last year and got a real bollocking from Guisell for doing so. But this, when Lula, that quote of that you mentioned from Lula, our war is with poverty, not with Russia. What does that say to the people who were protesting on the streets of Britain yesterday, on the streets of France the day before, who are having their pay forced down, their pensions taken away because their governments are ramping up the arms spending and the global Cold War and so on, that actually we should learn a lesson from these countries, that we don't always have to bow down to the United States. We don't always have to fight on the behalf of the US ruling class. We can forge our own path, and in fact in Latin America, against far more pressure than we've ever faced, they are managing to do that. So that's really, really inspirational. Now I'm not sure which order to take the pair of you next, but I think that if we stick with the Latin American theme, we'll go on to Dr. Lauren Collins from the Cuba Solidarity Campaign executive. Cuba, of course, has been, the absolute beacon, probably the most popular socialist country certainly in Britain. And having travelled to Cuba a long time ago, I know that there's a sort of reciprocal affection, not between the governments, obviously, but between the peoples, that there is a real feeling that British people have connected with the people of Cuba, and there's a real sense of solidarity there. I'm speaking to the Miami Five, who, members of the Miami Five who were imprisoned in the United States for a long time. So they never got more solidarity letters and campaigning than they did from this country. And that's a legacy of a really powerful solidarity movement, I think, which has been almost the model and I don't want to insult other solidarity movements from Latin America, but the Cuba Solidarity Campaign almost set an example that was then picked up by other solidarity campaigns as a way of helping countries that are under blockade, under persecution from the United States especially. So it's really, really good to have Dr. Lauren Collins here. She's an honorary research fellow at Nottingham University, as well as an expert on Cuba, and she's going to be talking about Cuba and environmental policy. Thanks.
I'm going to talk about Cuba's approach to mitigating and adapting to climate change, and how they do that and how they got to where they are. Cuba has long been aware of climate change. In 1992, at the Rio Earth Summit, Fidel Castro said, "Humankind is at risk of disappearing due to the rapid and progressive elimination of natural habitat. We are becoming aware of this problem when it is almost too late to prevent it." 1992. At the root of global inequality, roots of global inequality is the legacy of colonialism and the continuing exploitation of the global south by unfair trading and so on, lots of ways of that still continuing, obviously. And one of the manifestations of global inequality is the unequal impact of climate change. Rich nations, mostly of the global north, bear responsibility for the vast majority of the runaway greenhouse gas emissions and the desecration of the natural world, while the poor countries in global south are suffering the consequences right here, today, now. In Cuba's case, it's only responsible for 0.06%. I noticed Nicaragua was 2%. 0.02, yeah, 0.06 is Cuba's of the total greenhouse gas emissions. But like the whole region, and also places, I mean, the Pacific is another one, are experiencing more frequent and more ferocious hurricanes, rising sea levels, coastal erosion, salination of agricultural land, which, by the way, was already quite degraded by years of sugar plantations and so on, removal of the forests and long ago. It's got changed rainfall patterns and drought and higher temperatures, and all of this has a massive impact on human health and agriculture, and risks of that come with extreme weather. Since 1959, Cuba has sought to forge its own path to human and social development, and it has been cruelly and illegally subject to the harshest and longest sanctions imposed on any country in modern history, 60 years. And although this policy has failed to topple the Cuban government, which is the objective of it, it has serious consequences for the day-to-day life of the Cuban people, and it adds a massively huge challenges to dealing with climate change. Cuba is shut out from many of the international sources, poor as they are, for funding for adaptation and mitigation, thanks to the US blockade. Therefore, its approach is to prioritise actions, and it has to be creative, thrifty, and innovative in its approach. And the approach is underpinned by two main factors. The first is its commitment to and investment in education. In 1959, it started from a very low base. There was high literacy, and the educated professional classes cleared out. And it was a long haul throughout the 60s to get the population even to secondary school level. It was a very long haul, but it was done. It was only in 1976 that they created a Ministry for Higher Education, which they did. By 1986, there were 300,000 university students and an expanding postgraduate program. 2 years after that speech that Fidel made in 1992, the Ministry for Science, Technology and the Environment was created, SITMA, they call it. And by 1999, there were 221 research centres with more than 60,000 researchers. Now, I mention all this because it is relevant to how they're dealing with climate change now. And Cuba's expertise in science and medicine is well known all across the world. And there's a university, as well as specialist medical schools and pedagogic schools, but a university in every one of the 16 provinces. There were 3 universities in 1959. And in 2007, they did, in every one of Cuba's municipalities, there are 168 of them, they created municipal university centres, and they were supported by the provincial university. And this is important because it brought higher education right into the communities. People could take courses while they were working, local knowledge and expertise was used, and they could offer training courses on all sorts of things to the local population. So that's a really important thing. You know, it's not ivory tower stuff. It's community. It's got a strong community focus. Now, in 2017, the Cuban government approved a state plan to confront climate change, known as Tarea Vida, Project Life. And this plan is able to harness this world-class scientific expertise. And it's a framework. It's not a detailed plan. It's a framework with strategies and tasks laid out. And local communities, the subnational government and local communities, they audit and assess the dangers in their area with support from SITMA and other specialists. But that local knowledge is really important. So, and then that information can feed up to the national level, so national plans can be made and priorities made, but local people themselves assess their own situation. The strategic actions and tasks have as their main priorities preserving human life, number one, food security and water availability, fresh water availability, protecting the tourist industry, which may seem like a bit of a strange thing, but Cuba is absolutely reliant on foreign currency to import things that they absolutely need. Food, they don't produce all their own food. Food and medicines and spare parts and all sorts of things. So that's another of the objectives. The second factor that is important when thinking of Cuba's approach to adapting to climate change is the political and social organisations, the way they're structured for popular participation at the local level, at the subnational level, communities, municipalities, provinces. Amongst these structures are included popular councils, trade unions, Federation of Cuban Women, committees for the defence of the revolution, all of which are active locally, are local organisations. So to engage the community through local education availability and through all of these organisations, they can be mobilised, they can be made aware of what's happening. And these things are extremely important. It's not a top-down thing, it's everybody's issue. SITMA, the Ministry for Science, Technology and Environment, liaises closely with local government, and the municipal university centres are engaged in supporting data collection and so on. One of the tasks of Echaverry, which I think is also important, is communication to increase understanding and perception of risk, and therefore climate change studies has been introduced to the curricula at all levels, primary school to postgraduate. Everybody has climate studies in their education. School children and youth organisations are involved in a whole load of environmental projects, from cleaning beaches to carrying out environmental projects, to actually educating their parents about it, because they have these projects they come home with and all the rest of it. And I also want to say that climate change adaptation and mitigation is closely linked to the work that Cuba has done over the last 60 years to reduce the risk from disasters. And that's largely hurricanes, but other things too, floods, fires sometimes. And that experience of doing that has enabled them, it's all there, ready to go, to turn it to climate change. And every school, every workplace, every community is obliged to have regard for environmental impact to any plans they have at all. And the final thing I want to say is about international cooperation, which is a vital part of Cuba's approach. They are extremely willing and keen to work with experts from other parts of the world, the rich part of the world, the poor part of the world. They're really, really keen to do that, because they know that that exchange of information and experience leads to a much richer understanding of how to deal with things, and also they can then that knowledge and experience can be disseminated to others. So yes, that's it. Okay. I'm happy to.
And if you want to hear more from Lauren, If you read today's Morning Star, there's probably not a lot of time to find it in the shops now, but it will be online as well. That Lauren's got a brilliant article in today's Morning Star about the Cuban approaches to climate change. Now, Nicaragua and Cuba are small Latin American countries which are subjected to the US blockade, and we're looking today at different socialist solutions to the climate crisis. Dr. Johnson once used the phrase, let observation with extensive view survey mankind from China to Peru, and we're going all the way across the world now to the Far East, where we have a very different scenario, because China, of course, is a very large country. China is the only country which the United States government recognizes as what it calls a peer competitor. So a country which is neck and neck with the US in terms of economic size, in terms of technological, scientific advancement, and so on. It is, as we know from the worsening state of international relations, regarded by the US as the existential threat to US dominance of the world. I believe, and I said some introductory remarks, and we're behind time because of me, not because of the speakers who've been very good, that China has been a pioneer actually in climate change policy, has been a real innovator in this field. But we're going to pass over now to Paul Atkin, who's a member of the Green Jobs Alliance, part of the NE National Education Union, which had the fantastic strike performance yesterday, part of their climate change network, and a member of the No Cold War, to talk a little bit about China's approach in particular to this.
For a start, I'd just like to say, as a member of the NEU, the contrast between what Cuba's doing educationally and what we get from the Department for Education here is stunning. I won't go on about that. So what China, as Ben just said, what China does and doesn't do to tackle the climate crisis is going to have a huge impact on whether humanity succumbs to it or not. This is partly because it's already the world's largest economy in purchase power parity terms. It's got a population that's greater than Europe, North America, South America, and Australasia combined, so a 4-continent population. It's a developing country that has developed very successfully and is almost on the verge of becoming classified as a high-income country. It is now exceeding the US in the number of patents for new inventions that are filed. And it is a country that is run not by the private sector that makes the United States the best democracy that money can buy, but by a communist party of 90 million members, which makes a fundamental difference, which is why people can talk about it as a socialist country. This is in a context in which I think, as the other speakers have touched on, the US, which is the self-proclaimed indispensable nation or global leader, the country where the rules in the rules-bound international order are written, is failing spectacularly to lead the world in confronting its greatest existential crisis, which is the breakdown of the climatic conditions in which human society can actually continue to exist. And they're prioritising war instead. On current government spending, the US government is putting 14 times as much into its military as into the domestic green transition. And it's encouraging its allies to increase there too, and it's happening. The economic aspect of this is that because globalization now favours China, not the US is actively decoupling while screwing over its subordinate economic allies at the same time. China, by contrast, is spending more than double as much on green transition as on its military, and these are the right priorities because of the scale of the problem. Reports this week that the 1.5 degree limit is fast getting beyond reach, as well in yesterday's Morning Star, much too late to buy that today, should be a klaxon going off in all of our heads. Not an invitation to fatalism, because sometimes these things are reported as, oh, well, we tried that, we haven't reached it, let's think about other things. Because it should be something that makes us redouble our efforts to accelerate the scale and the speed with which this transition takes place. because the consequences of not doing so are so severe. This quote here is from, hang on a second, a thing called The Age of Consequences, Foreign Policy and National Security Implications of Global Climate Change, which was produced in 2007 by the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Center for New American Security. So you can see where they're coming from. The quote is, they're projecting different scenarios. This is the one we're heading towards. Not got there yet, but we're heading towards it if we don't row back. Governments with resources will be forced to engage in long, nightmarish episodes of triage, deciding what and who can be salvaged from engulfment by a disordered environment. The choices will need to be made primarily among the poorest, not just abroad, but at home. That's what we're heading for if we don't actually manage to get these carbon emissions down. The labour movement also has got to take the lead in this, is not least because if we don't, the widespread anxiety about the future will give rise to the tsunami of irrationality that we're already seeing, taking wilder and wilder forms. I mean, we should note that the capitalist class that emerged, at least in its own head, as a champion of reason and enlightenment, is going down, promoting collective insanity, QAnon and on. And the only question is whether they take us down with them. So socialist solutions are needed because, as the FT recently noted, the free market will solve the climate crisis, but not in time. Think about that. This is even recognised in the Skidmore review of the UK government net zero strategy, which notes, even though Skidmore himself was a joint author of Britannia Unchained with Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss of blessed memory, the state has to provide clear goals, legislative frameworks and sufficient investment for any transition to be viable. This is Skidmore saying this. And the US Inflation Reduction Act takes a similar approach, and that's jolted the EU now to streamline investment procedures, reset regulations and prime green pumps. This is better than letting the market follow its financial nose and hoping for the best, but it's still a framework in which the state supports private sector profitability, and it's the profitability that is the determinant of whether a transition takes place or not. And that clearly won't be good enough, even though every positive step within that framework should be pushed as far as it will possibly go. Which brings us back to China. In the context of the second phase of the wars for the new American century, which we're in now, and the great decoupling that goes with it, China will not get a favourable press in this country. I mean, we've all experienced it. And the dominance of a set of negative narratives means that relatively few people, even on the left, will give it the benefit of the doubt. This is sometimes seen in extreme cognitive dissonance. A recent Labour Party Foreign Policy Forum report said that China's dramatic success in poverty reduction in the last half century has been, this is a quote, possibly the single greatest contribution to human well-being in history. Let's just mull that one over for a minute. But then goes on to argue that for commercial and technical and intellectual disengagement from and military preparedness to confront the country, people and party that produced possibly the greatest single contribution to human well-being in history. There's a similar mindset in large parts of the climate movement. So on climate, does China get it? Beyond Xi Jinping's speeches about the need to build an ecological society and for global cooperation to achieve it, there's what China does domestically, how it acts internationally, and how these intertwine. I want to look at two key areas, even though Ben's touched on one of them already. One is energy transition. Now, China is obviously still heavily dependent on coal, and the media here keeps banging on about that. But from 2011, the quantity of coal burnt every year has plateaued, effectively, while the economy has grown dramatically. I'm sorry, I couldn't get the figures today because my internet's down. I blame Richard Branson, but anyway. China accounted last year, I think, for half the world's offshore wind investment on its own. And the current, which is the 14th five-year plan, envisages a better coordinated grid with renewables at its core, and coal relegated to a backup role. The International Energy Agency projects that China's 2030 target for renewable energy installation will be met by 2026, which indicates the sort of exponential growth needed for China's overall emissions to start dropping before the end of the decade. They dropped a bit last year, but that was a bit of an aberration. But we are getting to the point in which they are going to begin to do that. The IEA's assessment is also that the speed and scale of this drop will be further and faster than Western precedents. The IEA is no great friend of China, incidentally, but they do make this point. So this is possible and probable. At the same time, the decision to cease any funding for coal power stations as a part of the Belt and Road Initiative is estimated by the IEA again to have the same beneficial effect as the whole of the EU actually hitting net zero by 2050. So huge. It means that the paradigm for global South energy development, where China is hegemonic, will be via renewables. The dash for gas in Africa, pushed by the EU and the Tony Blair Institute, amongst others, at the last COP, is a depressing contrast. They're posing this as a transition fuel away from burning wood and so on, but it's not. It's for export to Europe. Similarly, on transport, in 2021, I think it was 21. This is all from memory because of the internet. Of 425,000 electric buses in the world, 2,500 of them were not in China. China produces more than 50% of the world's electric vehicles and more than 50% of the world's batteries for them. And it should be noted in passing that the only gigafactory actually producing batteries for electric vehicles in the UK is partly Chinese owned. I could wax very lyrical about the British Volt debacle at this point, but I won't because of time. Shenzhen, sorry I said that wrong, in southern China in 2016 converted its entire 16,000 bus fleet to electric in a year. London has 8,000 buses and we're going to take them some time in the early 2030s. And London's pretty good by UK standards, very good by UK standards actually. As Ben said, the rapid development of high-speed rail in China has saved it from dependence on medium-haul internal flights on the US model, which was the thing that actually put US emissions up last year, the recovery of the air industry, which is also an essential paradigm for viable global South development. You know, is Africa going to be knitted together by high-speed rail, or are they going to try and do it by flights? If they're trying to do it by flights, it's game over. So, socialists in the climate movement should, one, tell the truth about China and challenge lies, because there's a lot of them about. Two, oppose the war drive and the military spending, pushing for financial and technological transfers of the global South instead. Three, oppose the economic decoupling as detrimental to climate progress. Give one example here, US trade sanctions on Chinese solar panels has led to a 23% drop in installation of solar panels in the United States. So that's shooting themselves in the foot. And seek to win global solutions, win-win global solutions in the context of the most rapid possible green transition. That's it.
That was brilliant, Paul. Thanks very much. And I'd made a note to talk about the impact of the new Cold War on solar panels, and you've just made it at the very end of that speech. So that is, I think, a really important point because it ties it into how our government's policies and the US government policies at the moment are actively retarding global cooperation on what is a threat to all countries. So we are actively trying to sabotage the world leader in renewable technologies and prevent it from helping other countries to develop renewables. And yesterday, I was interviewing the leader of the GMB union. That interview will appear on Monday. It's mostly about the NHS and so on, the ambulance strikes, and he has a lot of opinions on climate change and so on, which I think most of us in this room would not necessarily agree with. But one thing he said about renewable energy, he said, well, in this country, it hasn't created jobs. Where Aberdeen, when they created that as an oil city, it created 200,000 jobs. It made a new kind of hub. Where is our Aberdeen for renewables? It's not here, it's in China, because they have economic planning and they do things, And I was like, well, you're not actually attacking green energy, you're attacking our government's lack of a strategy. And in fact, what you're saying is that the Chinese do have a strategy and it does work for Chinese people and it is benefiting Chinese manufacturing and all of those different things. As I said, we're a little bit behind time. I think originally, based on my calculation of Carlos's timings that he sent me, we were supposed to end at around 8:30. It's almost 8:15 now, but we do want to have some questions and discussion and so on. I'll take full blame. I did emphasise that I'm more used to banging on at people than being the chair. So that's probably why I've done that for half the meeting. But we will open it up now. So any questions? I know people are watching online as well, and if you put questions in the chat online, they'll be passed to me and we can get the panel to respond to those. So if anyone's got anything to ask, any of our brilliant speakers, now's the time to raise your hand. Yeah, Lee.
Martin, Luke Danielson of Caribbean Labour Solidarity. I wonder if the panel has an opinion on what we can do to limit the IMF in terms of the strategy what they're doing with the shock this week to find out that the Jamaican government, had to take an IMF loan, and one of the conditions was that they could not develop the agriculture. The state could not put money into it or support anybody to develop agriculture. Now, we live in a region which is, importing something like 80% of the food. This is a sun-rich region with some land, and that the IMF is putting pressure on governments in this kind of way. And I think it's happened to other countries as well in terms of the conditionalities, in terms of loans. How can we rein in the IMF?
Brilliant. I think as we're a little bit pressed for time, I'll take a few questions and then we'll ask people to come back on them after that. So there's a gentleman at the very back there.
As well, do you mind?
Ranjit Brown. I want to state my affiliation. I'm with a party called the CPG-BNL. But thank you so much for your contributions. It was really enjoyable and highlights some much neglected information about China. It always strikes me when we look at the environmental movement that it's it's not a new thing. It's not counterintuitive. Everyone wants a sustainable environment that can nurture humanity for generations to come. And of course, the big difference, which you're alluding to, between Cuba, Nicaragua, China, and our own situation is who holds the political power. We don't have the ability to solve these issues precisely because we don't have effective control over our state. The difference between our state implementing reforms and the Chinese state implementing reforms is that they've been through that process of social revolution. The people are, the people and the people's interests are in the driving seat. And for us, sadly, we lack that. It was interesting you alluding to Tony Blair, who, of course, is, some believe, the product of the Labour movement. The last Labour leader that we had as being one of those key criminals opposed against the interests of the masses of the people, wherever they stand, and against our own people here. You only have to think of the Gulf War as one of the great environmental crimes, whether it's depleted uranium or the continued extraction of fossil fuels. And of course, perhaps the biggest elephant in the room is I woke up this morning to hear that of the fantastic record profits posted by Shell, 40 billion this year, while we're all facing a cost of living crisis. And the real, worry is that the Green New Deal and the environmental movement, and right down to Thunberg, are essentially decoupling the genuine concerns of the mass of the people of the planet from that real question of social power. And really, if you look at NATO and the Ukraine war, is very much linked. Those interests who are destroying the planet are very much in the driving seat of NATO, of the EU, of our own country, of America. And so I guess my real question is, what are the panel's thoughts and our audience's thoughts on how we recouple that movement, of how we reclaim the leadership of that movement and point them in the direction which has led to these innovations that you point out in the countries that you quite rightfully name as very positive examples. So thank you so much for your contributions.
Did you had your hand in the middle there?
My name is Hani and I'm from Iraq. We are still occupied Iraq, by the way, updating you. So we are not really free. First, our money goes to United States. Secondly, United States dictate which company we should sign to get electricity for our consumption in the heat of the summer in Iraq. They are dictating to us. In fact, that is, if you have an agreement with a country, they could revoke it and they remove the prime minister or elected person and bring somebody who cannot read or write to be prime minister. Not now, but I mean the previous one. There is things which is we don't know about environment. For the Iraqis, we have about 5,000 dams on the Tigris and the Euphrates in Turkey, where historically Iraq is one of the biggest Middle Eastern agriculture land. Used to export rice, wheat, and the rest of food. This country now cannot feed itself. It has to import their own food. They have to import every damn thing since the invasion of the United States to Iraq. This is an environmental disaster made by invasion directly. That's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, so in relation to what we could do and what our colleague have mentioned in there, of course, we don't benefit from having a people's power and people's government like in China who can do environmental policies in a very big way. So what do we do in Britain? And I think what is needed is for the socialist movement and the cooperative movement, because I'm involved quite a lot in the cooperative movement, to come together doing real solutions. The government cannot do it in Britain. You know the corruption and you know what it is. So the people have taken it on themselves, not only in terms of campaigning, but in terms of doing. I mean, I was talking to my colleagues in Cooperative UK, which is the umbrella for the cooperative movement in Britain, and they're saying they are seeing a lot of trend of what they call them energy cooperatives. People are taking it to themselves. They are forming cooperatives. They are going to a school, putting solar panels on top of a school, working with themselves and trying to provide cheap energy for the houses in that area. So I think the socialist movement, apart from campaigning on policies, needs to align itself with the cooperative movement, bringing the trade union into it, where the financing could come, and really create examples of economic, political movement that shows results and shows people's power in reality. And for that we need to learn. So learning from Cuba, we're learning because we have to learn how to do it. We learn how to deal with energy. We have to learn how to manage ourselves better. So there is a lot of learning we have to do. So there is learning, there is political organization, and there is a cooperative organization. And I think this is really the future. I mean, like my colleague Hani, I come from Iraq. And we are trying to do the same thing in Iraq, but it could be done everywhere. People really come together, the trade union movement, the cooperative movement, the socialist movement, and do real work. This is, I think, part of the solution, actually.
Comrades who would like to speak. I think unless there haven't been any women coming forward so far, so I'll obviously take anyone who does want to come forward. But I'll ask Carlos and Francisco to go as Marian's closer to him to begin. I just mean I think we'll allow the panel to come back because it's difficult to answer 15 questions at once after these two. unless any women would like to ask a question, because there hasn't been any women put their hands up so far. Francisco.
Yeah, if that's okay, I don't want to ask any questions, just to mention a couple of important things. The level of self-sufficiency on food by Venezuela now, according to the last report from President Maduro, is 94%. Venezuela used to import 70% of the food it ate. So this has been done thanks to communal organizations and small enterprises, cooperatives, and even private enterprise. And these are small companies. Is that it generates a huge amount of employment. Venezuela has the benefit, as it were, of having most of the population in very small places at the top, and the rest is just land which hasn't been touched. And now there is a very determined effort to protect it. And the proportion of the oil that goes into the budget used to be nearly 80%, now it's 30%. Not necessarily by design, but because of the sanctions. I just wanted to say one more thing, which is, I know socialist countries are in the vanguard of this, everybody has spoken about this. But places such as Brazil, which is not the vanguard, is such an important place in terms of the environment. And Lula is determined to actually protect the environment, has appointed an indigenous woman to actually protect the Amazon and the indigenous people. Sonia Guajajara is the person in charge. And the Latin American governments now, the left-wing governments, are discussing, and this is with Colombia as well, to set up some sort of, I wouldn't call it cartel, but some sort of conglomerate of countries that are going to protect the environment collectively. And that's the alliance that you want to make with China and everybody else who is also doing the same. So this is very promising. And it doesn't have to be necessarily socialist, and it doesn't have to be totally red.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Clara?
Thank you.
So, well, firstly, I just really want to thank and congratulate the speakers for what I thought were really inspiring and informative talks from each of them, everyone from a very different perspective. And one thing that really resonated with me was what Paul said about telling the truth about China in the climate movement. Because if you think about what the climate movement in the West, in the major capitalist countries is calling for, it's a Green New Deal. But it's like a fringe radical thing. It feels like it's got basically no chance of actually coming to fruition. Meanwhile, you look at China, they're carrying out a Green New Deal on a basically unimaginable scale, on an inconceivable scale. And it's not a fringe radical left thing. It's the mainstream. It's what they're actually doing. So I think it's really important that we take that message to people. So a question that I had was just around the coordination between the different socialist and progressive countries in relation to this issue of tackling climate change. So climate cooperation. I know that that Nicaragua has joined up with the Belt and Road Initiative over the last couple of years. I know that Cuba has joined the Belt and Road Energy Partnership, and China's involved in investing in solar parks in Cuba and whatnot. To what extent are we developing a model of cooperation between countries of the global south, non-aligned countries, progressive countries, socialist countries, that can kind of build our collective understanding, build our collective knowledge and progress, but also start to counter sanctions, start to counter economic coercion, and to what extent do these processes of saving the planet and developing a multipolar system feed into each other?
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Carlos. There's been a few different themes raised. Do you want to pass some of these over? We've had some questions coming in online. We have one from Jerry, which is, we're still talking about net zero. That means entrepreneurs making a killing on offsets from corporations should be carbon neutral, ? This capitalist system is impossible. Should we still be talking about net zero? So that's an important one to consider. We have one from Ferdy, I think. Can the panel stand in solidarity with climate activists who are serving prison sentences for protesting? An increasingly important issue in Britain, of course, with all the authoritarian legislation being forced through by this government. And one from Ludi: what strategy does the panel recommend to achieve the international agreements required to reverse global warming? So we've got a huge range of topics. Some of those questions we could have a meeting as long as this one again to consider. I'm going to ask the panel to respond. I think we'll go in reverse order, starting with Paul, to as much as you can cover of that wide range of issues. From the floor, of course, we had issues around the IMF and its impact. We had issues on how do we recouple the sort of social and climate struggles in Britain, trade unions, links to co-ops, and so on. So
yeah, I mean, all of that is incredibly vast. And like you say, you could have an entire meeting on it, an entire conference on it. We do have entire conferences on it. I think in terms of go forward now, I mean, I think there's different elements to this because you've got a much wider climate movement than just the socialist current within it. So, I mean, there's different tasks. So you've got to kind of patiently explain your own point of view without making that a precondition for united fronts on, particular issues, or, putting solar panels up in your street or whatever it is, forming a local cooperative, or working with a local authority, including some quite, British local councillors who will nevertheless be happy to set up a low traffic neighbourhood or school street scheme, so there's a whole series of interlocking alliances and discussions to be had within them. Similarly, globally, on the one hand, you've got vast countries like China, relatively small countries like Nicaragua and Cuba, nevertheless doing very, very positive things. Other countries less engaged on the way, but also making efforts, not wanting to be dominated by the IMF. Plus, you've got a movement, generally, whatever the weaknesses of the climate movement here, it is very good on solidarity with the Global South. It will campaign very hard for technological and financial transfer, and that is something that we should continuously press, because the current government won't, is backed away from that. And won't want to do it. And the United States government won't want to do it, and they will want to do the kind of things that Lee was saying about, right, you can have some money to tide you over, but you can't develop your agricultural capacity. That sort of thing, that sort of rules-bound international order. So all ties up. So.
Excellent, thanks, Paul. Lauren, any thoughts?
Well, very quick one on the IMF. Of course, Cuba doesn't have that problem because the IMF will have nothing to do with them, which, the diversity of the climate movement in Europe, let's say, and maybe North America, I don't know. I mean, it's one of those old problems, isn't it? How do you decide to engage with which bits of it? And this is a very old question. You haven't got quite the line on that, and you're too wishy-washy about that. I can see all of that going on now, but I know that you can't wipe away all those issues. But however, I think that things like were suggested about people getting together and cooperatively setting up their own energy companies, fine. Okay. Sitting on a new coal mine site in Germany, fine. But that message all the time has to be got out, and it's up to socialists to make that point. And I get the feeling that that's cutting through. I really do. Whether or not that's going to be quick enough and important enough. But what we can't afford to do is cut people off because we don't quite agree with just what they're doing. Any contribution, it shows an awareness of what's happening, and engagement has got to be the thing. I would say. I can't say too much about coordination in the South. I forget where the question came from. I don't think I can really comment on that. Yeah, I think that's all I can say at the moment. Bit of
Thanks, Florian. And finally, Dan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, well, in response to some of the big questions about, what we should be organizing to do and focusing on, again, to me, I think the biggest, most important fight right now, which is, again, relates to the environment, but more directly is, I think we have to fight the war machine. I mean, frankly, what has become more pressing at the moment for human survival is the possibility of a nuclear war, which we have to acknowledge, right? The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has pushed the clock to 90 minutes to midnight, the closest it's ever been in human history. And the United States is now openly talking about, if you read the papers, limited, the possibility of limited nuclear war. They believe that that's a possibility. And that's a real danger. And that is the danger confronting humankind right now. So we have to oppose that. We have to oppose NATO's continued provocations against Russia, to call for a negotiated solution of the war in Ukraine, and to oppose the increasing move to war with China. I mean, China, I believe, is on the chopping block for the United States to attack. And the U.S. is being very clear about that. And it relates to what we're talking about in the sense that it's not because of whatever China's alleged failures or shortcomings are, it's because of their successes. The West cannot compete with China. It just can't, because it does not have a planned economy. And so, which China does. China is advancing in ways that the West cannot stop, except through war. And that's why they want war. And we need to be the voice against that. There is, thank you. There is a No to NATO rally coming up at the end of this month, I think February 25, which I would urge people to participate in. So yeah, I think that's the big fight again, and that relates directly to the environment as well, and also fighting sanctions. The sanctions against Russia have again undermined countries like Germany in their attempts to fight global climate change. We're going backwards on this, and we have to acknowledge why that is. The bigger question that I think was asked, we obviously have to build a movement for socialism. I think that movement was greatly, set back by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And I think we need to reclaim that effort to build socialism. And I do think that the choice is now, as Rosa Luxemburg, between socialism and barbarism. And we need to choose socialism. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I think that was inspirational. Excellent contributions from all of our speakers. Thanks to all of those. Thank you to the organizer of this event, particularly Carlos from Friends of Socialist China, and to the Nicaraguan Embassy, and to Cuba Solidarity Campaign and everyone who's been involved. I'm going to hand over to Marian Jump, who is the I think her title has changed recently, so she's now the director of the Marx Memorial Library. Marian is going to say a little bit about the wonderful venue which has hosted us tonight.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to host this event. It's been fascinating, I think, hearing all these arguments. I think there could be no better place than the Marx Memorial Library, this centre of socialist research and learning here in London. You would have noticed, I hope, that we've got this wonderful portrait of Fidel Castro up on our wall, and the plaque reads that it was actually unveiled during the Miami 5's Freedom Tour. So it's a pride of place here at the Marx Memorial Library. And just recently we've agreed to take the library of the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign, so that will be a really welcome addition to our collection. So we're really delighted about that. But yeah, it's our 90th birthday this year, founded in 1933. There's an awful lot going on here. We've got a library of 50,000 books and pamphlets, archives on all elements of Marxist thought and socialist history. And we've got lots of events like this one, courses, engaging with schools, doing lots of new things. So do join, find out more, and come back. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Everyone.
And I have a few books here if people are interested.